Can you hear me at the back? That'll be much more convenient.
You're on.
So all I ever wanted was to sell a tour to Israel. And here I find myself sitting in a synagogue in godforsaken south part of Arizona, talking about Israel. And it brings me back to the years right after 2000, when the second Intifada broke in Israel. And shortly after was the attack on the Twin Towers. And the tour industry of Israel was immediately shut down completely. And for a few months, I found myself turning back to the easiest can do to make a living and support my family. I went back to the Army. I wrote a book for the Army. I wrote a war manual for reconnaissance. I doubt if you can buy it on Amazon, especially for the Israeli Army. It's classified, but not in a high level of classification. And then I found myself traveling to the US quite a lot. And I found myself sitting in every possible place in the US. As I said earlier on our conversation, every godforsaken church or synagogue, but in between were several high school or even elementary school, willing to speak to any crowd who was willing to hear about Israel. My name is Nir Nitzan. In Hebrew, it means, Nir means feral in the field, and Nitzan means bud of a flower. My dad, as you can probably understand, was a farmer. I am a third on one side and fourth on the other side generation in Israel for Zionist parents. And I grew up to believe that there's no place better in the world than Israel. Known to be very proud Israeli. And growing up as a kid in the 1960s in Israel, we used to sing a song that was, I will not sing it, but the meaning was, the whole world is against us, but never mind, we shall overcome. And when I grew up and ran into the tour industry and met some other people around the world, I found out that it is not the whole world against us. We actually have some friends in some parts of the world. And it's always nice to have friends. And since Israel is just a speck on the map, if you open your map of America and take a big scale map, and in the north end of America, somewhere in the center, you will be able to see the Great Lakes. Israel can fit into Lake Michigan and be a big island. That's the size of Israel. And we are in the Middle East. They say that when Moses went up on Mount Sinai to write Torah, I mean, God was dictating and Moses was writing word by word what God had to say. And then Moses gets to the part that God says it's going to give the Jews the land of milk and honey. Moses figures it's going to be a good place, and he says to God, so what's going to cost me all this milk and honey? And God says, hey, Moshe, for you it's for free, but you just wait till you see the neighbors. And if you ever looked at the map of the Middle East, you can tell we're stuck in a very sensitive area. We were driving over here, and my wife sitting here with me, who is the best voice in my head and the most organized person in preparation, said to me, so what are you going to talk about? And let me get some bullet points for you, because I'm trying to cover in probably less than an hour. After this, you're going to fall asleep on me. I'm trying to cover what's life in Israel is today, and I figure it's such a big subject to talk about, and I'm going to try to talk about it through my eyes in a way. And we live in a different place of the world. We live where we open the door and there are enemies all around. And at the same time, we try to keep ourselves in a little island of peace and create a little heaven in this part of the world. And it's complicated. Nothing is easy where we come from. Um, and what I would like to try and do tonight is to talk to you about some parts of my own background and what's created me as an adult Israeli. Family man, father of three, all of my kids are adult, paying taxes, unfortunately. Although once my accountant said, you always want to pay tax. I said, why? So if you don't make any money, you don't pay tax. So you want to make some and pay some and cheat the best you can without getting caught. And that's part of the Israeli culture, I guess, definitely with the tax authorities. We speak English. English is the first second language we are forced to study in Israel. When I was a kid, English was compulsory from, I think, 3rd or 4th grade. Today, it's compulsory in Israel from 1st grade and on. So if you're not completely dumb, and or if you did not escape all classes in the 12 years of school, which is mandatory in Israel, then at the end of school, by the time you graduate high school, you should be able to communicate in English somehow. And most Israelis can speak English pretty well. The culture, however, is totally different. And when I said that culture is totally different, I remember it to the day because it happened. I was sitting in a school, I think it was elementary school, in Mount Kisco, New York, and was talking about, and one of the kids said to me, so what do you mean by cultural difference? And okay, I got to explain it. He said, well, what's the ultimate crime in your culture? And without thinking twice, murder, right? This can't be a worse crime than murder in the culture here. And what's the punishment for murder in this culture here? You're going to spend the rest of your life in jail, or they even put you on a chair or something similar, depending on which state you live in the US. So it's not just the ultimate crime, it's the ultimate punishment as well. We live in a part of the world where for some of our neighbors, if you target the right target, it's a ticket to heaven and 72 ugly virgins. So what for one is the ultimate crime, for another it's a ticket to heaven, and that creates a whole different set of values that we're not even measuring by the same values in the neighborhood where we live. So that's maybe explaining the neighborhood, the greater neighborhood of the Middle East. At the same time, in Israel, on a Friday night, you go to the party nobody ever invited you. You have a friend, and the friend knows somebody, and the somebody had a younger sister, and she used to date a boy, and this boy knows about a party, and you go to. And the first thing that happens to you is that somebody will greet you with a great hello and a glass of wine, and before even asking for your name, he's going to ask you, so how much you make a month? Followed by the comment, do not worry about this, because either his cousin or his second cousin or somebody in the line is first cousin with your employer, and Sunday morning, because Sunday morning is a regular working day in Israel, Sunday morning he's going to talk to his cousin, to speak to the other cousin, to speak to your employer, to pay you more because obviously you're not being paid enough. And that's, he knows, over this glass of wine. And the next question is going to be, where and with whom did you spend last night? And even this question gets sometimes some comments. And eventually, he's going to ask you, so whom did you vote to last election? Followed by the comment, are you going to be that stupid next election? And with a culture that has 15 different parties, and the most messed up in the world system, political system, you can remain stupid in somebody's eyes even if you're Einstein. And that's the culture where we come from. Nobody in Israel drives straight in one line on the road. People zigzag all the time. The other line got to be better. Our vehicle probably make double the mileage just because of the way people drive. Nobody, almost nobody, use their blinkers. Do I need to tell the idiot behind where I'm going? I don't know him. And that's the kind of funny part of our culture. Nobody stands in line. Everybody knows somebody up the line who will cut short the line for him. And at the same time, these people who will elbow you in line will invite you for dinner on Shabbat if they hear you speak in English because you're a guest. You came to visit our country in difficult time and you deserve to be invited for dinner in my house. And this will be totally genuine. So the same people who will go over you in line will be the nicest to you when it comes to anything that you need. We had some major security events in the last few years in Israel. One of them was the second war in Lebanon in 2006. The Hezbollah was shooting our north end of Israel with thousands of rockets. And the entire population moved south and was hosted in people's homes. It's unbelievable the camaraderie and the assistance. People went out of their way to the same people that are going to walk over them in line to the movies, but if it's a time of danger, it's a time to help and support. And that's the very strange conglomerate that creates our society. Give or take 80% of the Israelis today were born in Israel. But if you go one generation backwards, it goes down dramatically in the numbers. So we are a conglomerate that is built from people who came from all over the world, beginning to come in the middle 1800s and still coming today. And this form a very interesting society that speaks several languages, that think in a different way within this society. And just to make it more difficult, we have 12% of our population which is ultra-Orthodox, that doesn't even speak Hebrew because they speak Yiddish, because Hebrew is too of a religious, too holy language to speak in the street. We have 21% of the population which is Arab. Most of it is Muslim. And that's one more piece of the unbelievable puzzle that built Israel. And at the end of the day, this is the one and only democracy in the Middle East. With our messed up political system, and with the strange way it's built, it's still the one and only democracy in the Middle East. And it is a real democracy where you can speak your mind, and where we're having our 4th or 5th election in 2 years, 5th, just because the system did not allow us to form a government in the simple way. So that's an introduction, in a way, to our conversation. So I was born 63 years ago in a small farming community in Israel. Both my parents were born in Israel. Some of my grandparents were born in Israel. My father was just a little over 16 years of age when he fixed his ID to be 17, which was the draft age to join the Palmach, the pre-IDF militia who was fighting for the war of independence. And then it was part of a group that established the farming community where I grew up. I don't think that the idea of moshav and or kibbutz exists elsewhere. We're going to touch those communities in a minute, but I grew up in a community of 65 farmers who each had his own little farm, tiny little farm. 15 acres was the farm that one was supposed to make a living out of. And at least in the 1950s and 60s, it was possible to make a living out of such a small farm. Obviously, the farming in Israel was always very intensive farming. Spent 4 years in compulsory service and then many more years in reserve service, which is very different than the system here in America. In Israel, you first have to be regular, and only then you become reservist, unlike here, where you can be a reservist your entire career. Big part of my social net is the net that was established during my military service, both regular and reserve, into a level that is hard to believe. I guess the camaraderie that exists between us. Unit I commanded had 150 men in it throughout, and these people are in touch many years after we're no longer in service. Got married almost 40 years ago. Good-looking woman who's sitting here, and we raised 3 kids. Still raising them. World is changing, I guess. Once upon a time, and that's part of your culture, I guess. Kids get to the age of finish college, and they kiss you goodbye, and they go to college far away from home. We still have a 30-year-old girl in the house with her baby and her husband. They're moving soon. In fact, I'm going to be sad when they'll move out, at least when the baby moves out. The kids, I don't mind. But it's part of the culture that kids would stay sometime longer with or close enough to their parents. I was trained as a tour guide about 30 years ago, and guided tours for a good 25 or 30 years. That's probably 40 years ago that I was trained. And 10 years ago, I established my own tour company. And it grew slowly to what it is today. 5 years ago, I was able to convince my wife who was retired from the Israeli police, to join me and help, because first I needed the help, and second, she's much smarter than I am, much more qualified. And then the business was growing in a way that I actually needed somebody to manage it, and that's definitely her added value into it. I consider myself what you would probably call the salt of the earth. I'm a good guy. I pay my tax. I pay my duties most of the time. Been a member of parents' board in high school for my kids. An active member of the society. At the same time, trying to follow up with what I really believe in, and I truly believe in the Zionist idea and the right to exist of Israel, and definitely the not just the right to exist, but the fact that Israel should exist as homeland for the Jews. At the same time, I strongly believe over time of working with non-Israelis for most of the adulthood part of my life, that Israel is not just a Jewish state on the globe, but Israel is the land of the Jews. And it's not just semantic, it's philosophic. If you'll give it a little bit more thinking, I believe that every Jew around the globe has a share in this business. Maybe not an active share, they don't live there, but definitely a share in that business. And that's the way my adult life had taught me. Israel is a serious conglomerate. It's built from different groups any way you slice it. You can slice the society by Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox and modern Orthodox and kind of traditional Jews, and then the majority will be what you would call unaffiliated Jews, but they are all affiliated somehow anyway. So that's the religious way to cut Israel. But then we have a large minority of Muslim Arabs that have a small minority within them of Christian Arabs. and the Christian Arabs are probably subdivided to every possible Christian denomination you can think of that exist inside this group. We have few other minorities of like the Druze, who are Arabs but they're not Muslims and nothing alike anything else. And that's just a basic religious breakdown. But if you break the Jewish society again, then we have Ashkenazi Jews and we have Sephardi Jews, but we also have Yemenite, who doesn't really fall well in any category, or the Ethiopians now, that probably would consider themselves part of the Sephardi Jews, but they're not really Sephardi. They wouldn't qualify to any of the definition that makes them Sephardis. And so we have different groups any way you slice the Israeli culture, and somehow it works. If you slice the society of Israel by the way of where people live, then the big cities of Israel is Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. And between these three cities, which are the center of Israel, give or take, probably 2/3 of the population of Israel lives. The 9 million people who live in Israel, probably 2/3 of them will be living between Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem, maybe even more than 2/3, probably more. The rest would live either in smaller towns or cities, but we do have, still exist, the idea of kibbutz that was established in Israel. Israelis established the smartest ever patent in human history, and it's not flash drive. Way before high tech, Israelis established the idea, or invented the idea, of how can people share nothing. The pure socialism was the idea of kibbutz. Group of people came to Israel from mostly East Europe and figure we are all very poor, we have nothing, but if we share the nothing, everybody has less of a nothing, so we have more. And they created literally pure socialism that actually worked for a while until they got rich. And they found out that sharing poverty works perfect for mankind, but sharing wealth doesn't really work well. It just collapsed over that point. So around the 80s, kibbutzes in Israel started changing. Until the 80s, this was a highlight. Every kid in the world growing up, learning about the idea of kibbutz and sharing, figure coming to Israel, the flower kids of the world all came to Israel to feel pure socialism and smoke some stuff that wasn't quite legal back then. And now Israel, by the way, is one of the leading places in the world with developing marijuana. Israeli companies are creating the means to farm it, either personally or in a greenhouse. Israeli companies are leading the world in developing the products out of marijuana became now legal. And what was only a few years ago totally illegal is now making a lot of Israeli people quite wealthy. And that's just one item of many. Innovation is definitely an Israeli second name. Until recently, Israel had zero national resources, and the only national resource we had, as the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, said, Yiddish Kopf, Jewish brain. And Ben-Gurion said once that 60% of Israel is desert, the entire south end of Israel. And if we will not learn how to develop this part of Israel, we're not as smart as we believe we are. And we'll learn how to do it. Or we're still learning, but we are actually trying to do it. But we invested in something that can make us wealthy without taken it out of the ground. So we have no oil, we have no gold, diamonds, no natural resources. But Israel became the place where every giant in the world is coming to hunt to buy some high-tech companies. And a whole bunch of Israeli kids became beyond imagination wealthy for selling something nobody really needs, but willing to pay a fortune for. And I'm pretty sure that many of you are using the technology of Waze. I don't know how many of you know that Waze was developed in Israel by a small company of only 50 people, who all became beyond imagination wealthy because the founders of the company could not really pay salaries at the very beginning, and they were paying with shares, believing that they have a gold mine under their hands. So they didn't pay too many shares, so the founders are still very, very wealthy, and the other people are just wealthy. But that's actually worked out well. Everybody uses flash drives here. It's an Israeli patent. And you go on and on with all those patents that made Israel a target for probably every large company in the world to come and buy, including your giants. We have, as part of our society, and that mixes with our politics, we have what you know as settlers that are also not one group. It's a broken down group into a lot of variation. But the idea of settlers, and I guess my father was a settler when he built a little farming community where we live, but not in the sense, not in the political sense. And the political sense talks about settlers who live in those areas that Israel has taken out of our neighbors' hands in 1967. Until 1967, Israel was even smaller than today. In 1967, Israel has taken the West Bank and big parts of the Sinai Peninsula and parts of the Golan Heights. And almost immediately after, young Israelis, mostly those who believed in what we call the large Israel, moved to live in those areas and develop settlements. They became political very early on. And what was done first by people from all levels of Israeli society ended up today with mostly Orthodox people who are living in those territories, believing that they're fulfilling some prophetic fulfillments, and that's why they have to be there sometime in strange and dangerous places. But there's definitely a major segment of our both politics and society. The successful farming communities of Israel, kibbutz and moshav, in total are probably no more than 5% of the entire population of Israel. And they basically farm all the farming land of Israel, maybe 6% of the population, but not more than this. But until the 1980s, this group produced more than 20% of the pilots of the Israeli army. Something was done good in those communities to produce people who were aiming high. Israel was established as a democratic state. But if you read the Declaration of Independence of Israel, you will find out that the idea was that the Jewish people are returning to homeland to establish a Jewish state, considering all the minorities who still live in the country. But our national anthem, Hatikva, uh, creates issues if you're not Jewish, because part of the anthem talks about the Jewish soul that brings you back into the land of Israel and if you're not Jewish, there's some problem already with non-Jewish citizens when they figure the national anthem of Israel. At the same time, the national anthem of Israel creates a lot of problems to a whole bunch of Jews who are extremely religious. The ultra-Orthodox will not stand still on our Memorial Day or will not sing our national anthem at the same time, although they're Jews. So the subdivision of our society creates serious challenges for the future, definitely in light of the miracle that happened in Israel in the last year. And the miracle I'm talking about is the establishment of our government. We spent a whole year of elections without being able to form a government. And at the end of that year, we had one more election, and then we established a government. It only lasted for a year, sadly, in my eyes. But the miracle is it was the first time that Arab citizens were involved in the government. It never happened before. And suddenly we got Arab citizens involved, and again, in my eyes, in a beautiful way of involvement, with great achievement on both ends. And one end will be to get the Arab society closer to the Israeli society, or the Jewish society in Israel, and the other hand is to bring up to the table a lot of the issues that concern the Arab minority, who is actually quite a large minority. 21% is not a minority you can ignore. And so that's something that, again, in my eyes, was a big miracle. And luckily, I believe that the leader of this Arab party who came in was very, very smart to use his connections and the fact he was able to be part of the government to make some difference, both to the Arab citizens, but also I think on the Israeli mind that finally got Arab citizens in the government and the world did not come to an end. Was something very important to see. Israel does not have separation of state and religion. We have religious parties in our parliament, religious parties who are using their power to create all kind of special benefits to their group that are really upsetting for the other people, or at least some of the other people. And so the fact there is no separation of state and church are definitely creating future issues that we will have to address sometime. If you came to the Middle East 85 years ago, you would find out that the average income in the Middle East was about $1,500, $1,200 a year. I read somewhere, and I'm not sure I'm correct, but I believe this is about the right numbers. About the same time, the average income in America was about $5,000 a year. 80 years later, the average income in Israel is between $35,000 and $40,000 a year. In the rest of the Middle East, it's still $1,200 a year. Even though some of those countries are the richest in the world with oil and gas.
Right.
That's something to consider and to look at. Nevertheless, the gap in Israel between the have and the have-not is growing, unfortunately. Israel, that was for almost 55 years of its existence a very socialist place, is becoming over-capitalistic in the last decade and a half. the cost of living in Israel right now is very expensive. Tel Aviv is probably as expensive, if not even more, than New York, especially when you compare income level in those places. So on the one hand, there is already a strong Israeli philanthropic in Israel. But on the other hand, there is a growing segment of the population who needs help, who is way behind the line as we see it. Unfortunately, our last event in the world, major event known as COVID-19, enlarged the gap. It allowed some of the wealthy people to become wealthier. It definitely did some damage to the lower income segments of the population. Israel was the first to shut down completely when COVID-19 began. Totally shut down. We had lockdown on our neighborhoods, and the only way to go out of the house legally was if you go to get groceries or you're taking your dog. And suddenly people got, some dogs complained about being taken out way too many times during COVID. At the same time, once the decision, and Israel was the first to get a vaccine, almost in a not quite responsible way, our leaders decided they were very late to sign the contract with the drug companies, and they found out that if they want the vaccine, it's going to cost a fortune to Israel. And what they did was to offer the drug companies, we're going to be the lab. We're going to give everybody the drug, give us as much. And Israelis were the first to get the drug, the vaccine. Israeli government published the records, the result to the drug companies. I'm not sure with the consent of all Israeli citizens. I'm not quite sure that the idea like this would have worked in a society like yours, where individual freedom rights are in the front. But in Israel it worked out, and thank God it worked out well. It turned out that the vaccine works actually, give or take. And most Israelis are booster vaccinated with the 4th booster already. And when many of the Israelis finally got COVID, the rate of death was much smaller because many people were already vaccinated. For those of you who are planning trips to Israel soon, Israel is totally open. What was totally closed for a long time has 0 restrictions right now. The only restriction still available or still used is that you still need to fill up a form about your health before entering Israel. But in 80% of the places, they don't even check it anymore. It used to be very strict element that you could not board flights to Israel unless you filled up, you could prove you filled up the form, and now nobody really looks at it. So if you're planning a tour to Israel soon, most of the population is vaccinated, and you don't need to show any document that you are vaccinated or not. We simply don't care. We're so vaccinated, so if you're not, it's your problem. That's the way it is perceived in Israel. Many years ago, as a young guide, I had the honor and the privilege to guide in Israel the governor of the whole of Alabama. And Governor Fob James Jr. came with an entourage to Israel, and I was guiding this tour. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because I made friends with one of the people that came with Governor James. This gentleman was, I found out later, a businessman who owned here in the U.S. the largest in the world sod farm. He owned 20,000 acres of sod. His sod company made the sod for the Olympic in Atlanta and for some of the most famous golf courses in the U.S. and so on and so on. And he found out I grew up in a farm, and he extended his stay in Israel. And we put him on a broken sofa in our living room at that time in our house, looking backwards. Interesting, but I thought the guy staying and he wanted to learn about farming, and the best farmer I know is my neighbor, who happened to be my dad. And I got to, and my dad doesn't speak much English, so I called home and I said to my wife, I'm going to bring some work home. I said, what do you mean? I got a guest who's going to stay with us. And her first response was, find yourself and your guest a nice hotel room somewhere. But we got home. Obviously, she fixed a great dinner. And I found myself friend with a farmer from Alabama. And we were talking, we were driving around the country, seeing some farms, he got some ideas. He brought a lot of it back to the US, to his farms. And in one of our conversations, he says to me, you know, we're about the same age. We have relatively similar background of farming. And there's a great difference between us. He said, I never, ever think about personal safety. I live in a country where there's no threat from our borders, ever. He said, when I go to a big city, I'm worried. But where I live, he said, and you live in a place where you wake up in the morning and there's a threat. And you go to bed in the evening and there's a threat. And at the same time, our streets were extremely safe. Almost zero street crime in Israel. And this is something that I think that if you live in America, especially in Green Valley, Arizona, you don't think about the Canadians shooting rockets on your village and or the Mexicans. It just doesn't never crossed your mind. But only a few months ago, we had rockets coming from Gaza. And we happen to live in a small town which is in the 40 miles range from Gaza, meaning rockets can fall in our backyard. And the next thing I know, my daughter, who as you already all know now, live in our house with her baby and her husband in the second floor in our house. And she came to me and said, maybe the baby can sleep with you because if the alarm goes on at night, she doesn't want to run down the stairs to the shelter. We have a shelter, a bomb shelter in our house. This is standard in every Israeli home that was built ever since the 1980s and on. You must have a bomb shelter in the house. We use it as a storage room. Other people use it as an extra room in the house or whatever. But she was afraid to run down with the baby. And I built for my grandson a little place under my bed, and mattress, and ended up I was sleeping in a mattress. He was sleeping with my wife. But the idea that you are thinking about the need to run to the shelter in the middle of the night, I think never crossed your mind. I know some of you are old enough to grow up here in America in the days of the missile, whatever, and they told you need to get under the table and put your hand in your head with the atomic weapon will fall in your backyard. But we're actually talking about, it's not a nuclear weapon, it's a little rocket, but if it falls in the backyard, it makes a big bang. So that's, and if you live in our little town, which is, and by the way, the little town where we live, we are now building in our property a second building, and that's where our daughter and son-in-law are going to live. But this is the piece of land that my grandmother was given as a wedding gift when she got married. And we were lucky enough to buy it from family eventually and have it. But we have, the deed we have to our property is a Turkish deed. My great-grandfather purchased land in this little town, and that's precious to us.
Yeah.
I was talking about the thinking about where we live, and the flight time of those rockets from Gaza to our town is 75 seconds.
Oh my goodness.
So that sounds like nothing, right? And as Hannah, my wife, says, they always shoot the rockets when she's in the shower. But 75 seconds is enough time for her to put on a towel and dry up enough and get to the shelter. But if you live in the town of Sderot or nearby, if you live closer to Gaza, the time is 15 seconds.
Oh my.
15 seconds is not enough to dry up. You have to run naked out of the shower to get, otherwise you'll never make it.
Yeah.
And if you're raising kids in this area, which is 5, 6, 7 miles away from the Gaza Strip, and you're driving your car and the alarm goes on, and you have 2 kids strapped at the back, you need to decide which one of the kids you take first.
Oh.
You can't take them both at the same time. And if you're thinking about this, this is creating probably serious psychological
Absolutely.
opportunities for psychologists to take care in the future. But so many psychologists in Israel. But I'm laughing, but it's the reality when you live close to the border. And in the last 15 years, it's in the south border, but we have a member of your community who lives here and used to live in the north. Once upon a time, it was on the border where you lived. It's changing, and again, Israel is slightly smaller than Lake Michigan. That's something that you always have to remember. The first time I landed in America, and I was going to visit my friend in Alabama, I realized that the joke we tell in Israel is a serious joke. And the joke is about the Israeli guy who had a cousin in Texas. And he comes to visit his cousin, and the cousin tells him, you know, we got a farm here, and the farm is so big. I get in the car in the morning, and I drive all day long before I get to the end of my farm. And the Israeli guy said, well, we used to have such a bad car once. But we're not even aware that somebody's real estate can be so big that you can drive all day to get to the far end of it. So with this, I've been able to talk my way about 50 minutes, as the clock says behind. And I guess it's time to allow you to ask questions.
That's one thing, as a psychologist, retired, I just have always wondered, and I'm not Jewish, but what is it, you're just conditioned to react as, you know, we have to do this? Is that part of life? I mean, how did the kids handle it?
So the answer is, on the one hand, on the very global answer is, I don't know. I have never experienced anything else.
Oh, okay.
I got a call from somebody who was asking about security in Israel, asking me about what's going to be like security-wise to come to Israel. And I said, you're asking the wrong person. He said, why? You're Israeli? He said, yes, but you know, when my hair was a little darker, I was a lieutenant colonel in the army. I commanded a reconnaissance unit, and the way I estimate danger is probably totally different than the way you estimate it here, or the way you approach it here. At the same time, I'm raising kids in Israel.
I know.
I never lived so close to the borders, I don't know. I can say one thing for sure. You can ask my wife about this. She'll be able to share much more than I do, because on our better years, on our younger years of life, I was young and lots of testosterone, playing soldier all the time. So every time there was danger, she was alone in the house. And I was playing soldier somewhere on the borders with my men. When the Gulf War broke down, the first Gulf War, and we had assumed that the Iraqis, Saddam, may shoot chemical weapon on Israel. We were preparing for this. And how were we preparing? Every Israeli was given a gas mask. If you were under the age of 4, the gas mask was a hood that covered you all the way down to your waist, with a filter somewhere outside, and the filter came with a battery. So we assume a young kid would not be able to inhale on his own. I was stationed in Ramallah, but at that time we did not have a shelter yet in the house. It was the old part of the building. We didn't build a new one yet, so no shelter. And we were told to prepare a safe room in the house. And how should we prepare it? We should put plastic nylon on the windows, and we should put towel under the door, and stay in a room which is in the center of the house if possible, and wear the gas masks. Well, I was away with my boys. I was given all kind of atropine and whatever other shots you do in chemical war. And she was 8 months pregnant and had a 4-year-old baby in the house. And I got the information. In Israel, it's nothing is really formal. One of my officers, one of my lieutenants, his brother was a senior Mossad agent. And so we got information that the army was not given yet. His brother told him that tomorrow night, midnight, they're going to shoot. And they did. So tomorrow night, midnight, I called home and said, honey, they're going to shoot soon. You better prepare and wake up the baby. And I wasn't even there.
Not only the baby, your father also.
Yeah, she had to wake up my dad as well
Slept well.
in the next building, and my dad didn't want to wake up. My dad, he's a veteran of big wars. He fought. This chemical nonsense is not going to get him out of bed in the middle of the night. He had to fight my dad to come and put on the mask because it's an example for the baby. And she had to fight the baby to put on the mask. And meanwhile, she's 8 months pregnant. And that's...
That's life.
The next time she had to deal with it, probably in a high level, was probably in 2006, Second Lebanon War. Second Lebanon War, we already had a son in the army, and our son gave me the biggest honor in the world, and he served in the unit I commanded 30 years before. So we had a son in one of those recon units, and I was called for the last time that I was still active, and she had both me and him in uniform. So I'm pretty, luckily the son at that time was still in boot camp. He was not supposed to do any fighting. My unit was supposed to, but ended up not doing any. So that's the situation people have to deal with on a daily basis, and that definitely creates some sense of difference. Many years ago, David Ben-Gurion had some dispute with President Kennedy. And Kennedy says something like, I'm the president of 200 million people, and I need to be re-elected and do what they want. And David Ben-Gurion answered him, well, I'm the prime minister of only 3 million people, but they are the prime minister. They think I work for them. So I got 3 million prime ministers in my country who all tell me how to handle. And I guess that's part of our culture and society. Everybody in Israel knows better than you do. And they make sure that you'll know that they know better. And that's part of the culture. Israel is beyond any thought, at least for me, a miracle. The creation of this country against all odds, in the middle of a neighborhood that doesn't like us understatement. And taken a very poor country that had no natural resources at all and making it the world leading high-tech nation is a miracle. The fact that we have this conglomerate of political, social, cultural conglomerate, and yet the system somehow works, it is a miracle again. And I believe in this miracle. That's where I live my life. Quite proud of it most of the time. Again, questions if you have any. Yes, sir.
Does Israel get most of its usable water from desalination?
Yes. We used to have enough water resources. And about 40 years ago, an Israeli engineer came up to the government and said, gentlemen, Uarika, I have this patent. I invented reverse osmosis, and it's a very good way to desalinate water. Why don't the government buy it? And the government told him, we got enough water, we don't want it. And he sold it to a company in California. He was made millionaire, and so are they. And now Israel buy back the rights to use reverse osmosis. But we desalinate quite a lot. We recycle almost 70% of the used water of Israel. While the rest of the world, maybe 10% of the water we recycle as much as 70%. The need made us. Drip irrigation is an Israeli patent. The entire world used now drip irrigation. It was made in a kibbutz because they in the desert because they did not have enough water to water their fields. So necessity is the mother of all inventions. So yes, Israel desalinated a lot of water.
Who's your hero?
Who's my hero?
Your Israeli hero. Well, and exclude your family, but because that could be an obvious.
That's a given.
Yeah.
That could be a given.
You saw me blinking on my wife. So I guess I have more than one hero in that respect. One of them is definitely David Ben-Gurion, the father of modern Israel. If you read his biography, he was a little tyrant eventually, but the man had an amazing vision. He knew where he was going, and he believed in what he was doing. He made tons of mistakes on the way, but he is the mastermind and the man who had the courage to declare Israel's independence in 1948. So he is definitely one of my heroes. Another one is another one of our prime ministers, Yitzhak Rabin, was definitely one of my heroes. Rabin, a product of Israel, a man that was born in Israel, grew up with the same ideas I have been raised on. Was the youngest brigade commander in the Israeli military in the War of Independence. Man was 24 years old, brigade commander. Became the commander of our army and had the courage, in my eyes, to make peace with the Palestinians. And had he not been murdered, maybe the Middle East would have looked much nicer than it is now. So he's definitely another one of my heroes. And then a few others. My wife is definitely a hero in my private life. The way she handled me to begin with, and life and raising our kids. Some of my friends, men I had the privilege to command and definitely show greatness. So I have some, but any other question? Yes, sir.
The housing crisis in Israel.
It was one of the bullet points here on my...
One that you tried to avoid.
I'm one of the lucky ones who was able to buy property many years ago, and I bought the property I have in a God-forsaken little town back then that now it became crown jewel. And the housing crisis in Israel is, in my eyes, not real one. I mean, it's real for people who need to pay. It was created by our politicians for their needs, and they can solve it, in my eyes. We unfortunately are looking in the last probably decade of our life in Israel, maybe more than a decade, of a very corrupt leadership. And that's the main reason for the housing crisis in Israel. It should not be this way, and it must be fixed, and the sooner the better. But it's a real crisis. It's heartbreaking when young kids can. In Israel, everybody buys a house or an apartment. Very few people, or people rent only if there's no other way, and the goal of everybody is to buy. And something went wrong in that process, and I don't really understand enough in economy, but it's beyond any doubt, my doubt. It was political decisions and something wrong done by our politicians. Any other question?
You mentioned two groups that are prominent in agriculture,
Kibbutz and Moshav.
Mushana, can you explain what that group is?
Yes, kibbutz is a complete partnership. Everybody, they come together, acquire the land. They don't buy the land, by the way. They acquire the land. Usually, either in modern time, the government gives them the land. Before Israel government was established, it would have been given by some Jewish philanthropist or the Jewish agency, and then they say, okay, the land belong to all of us. We're going to share. We're going to each work as hard as we can to make it work out for the best. Kibbutzes all started as farming communities. Over time, especially in the 70s and the 80s, got into industry. Many of them got into high-tech industry. And some of them became very wealthy societies. In some cases, they broke because of too much wealth. In some cases, they were able to split without breaking down and killing each other. The kibbutz who owned the patent on drip irrigation sold the factory a couple of years ago. They hand a check, like $1 million shekel, to every member. In the 1970s, growing up I grew up in a moshav. Moshav, the idea was similar but different. Similar in the way of getting the land, but then redividing the land between the members, the farmers, and each farmer got an equal piece of land and would farm whatever he liked on this farm. And the more skills or the more talent you had would be part of your success. But in a moshav, the idea of the guarantee that if I did very well and you did very bad one year, I will pay a little more tax and help you out of your problem. And understanding it that in farming, one year I do well, while the other year you do well, and somehow we balance to each other, because farming, especially in small farms, has dramatic ups and downs. These are the two forms. Both of them do not really exist today. When they exist, but in a very different formation than they did when I was a kid. Today in the kibbutz, several kibbutzes joined together, so they have a larger farming areas and larger farms and so on. And the judgment of what to farm is what's going to do best for our economy. In Moshav, farming is either extremely intensive. When I grew up in a farm, my dad had 1 acre out of the 15 acres of land he was farming, 1 acre of greenhouses for roses. And this was the main income. 1 acre could support a family. And roses for export to Europe. And the other 14 acres were mostly peaches. And the peaches, 1 year you make money, 1 year you lose money. Wasn't a major thing, but the income came from the greenhouse. Today, I believe you need more than 1 acre to make a living. And today, many of the farmers joined up in groups to have larger farms to make it more profitable. But that's the two forms. There's hardly any individual big farms in Israel.
There used to be a third, Moshav Shitufi. They still have
Yeah,
those?
there was Moshav Shitufi somewhere in the middle between
Yeah, it's a
Moshav and
hybrid of Moshav and a kibbutz.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you think there will be some time where the Israeli government and the population will be, the Jewish will be a minority?
I want to make sure I understand the question. Do I believe that the Jews can sometimes be a minority in Israel? So right now, the Jews are 78% of the population. If it's ever going to happen, it's going to take a while. The birth rates of the Israeli and Arab citizens in Israel are so that it's probably not going to change by far, the equation. Given to that some Jews are still immigrating to Israel under the law of return. So somehow the percentage is changing very, very minimal over the years. Personally, I hope that Jews will remain the majority of Israel forever and a day. Can I predict? I cannot. Prophecy was given to the fools. But I was very happy to see Arabs participating in our government. Many Israelis were scared from the idea. I was actually happy.
Thank you very much.
You're
Thank you
most
very
welcome.
much.